join for the talk today. As we are on different time zones. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the monthly seminar series organized by Laws of Social Reproduction Project. We have Dr. Latika Singh, our speaker today. First of all, I want to thank her for agreeing to present her work despite her other work commitments. Dr. Singh will present her paper on Dalit Bahujan perspectives on work and labor in paid domestic work. This work delves into the mutually entangled making of caste and paid domestic work in India. Dr. Singh has a very interesting trajectory of work and scholarship. She has a doctorate in women's studies from the University of New York and is currently an honorary research fellow at the University of Wolverhampton, UK. Her main research interest is the reproduction of social injustices through our mundane daily practices that straddles both the private and public spheres across cultures, in particular the British and Indian context. Latika is currently working in the area of analyzing oppression through unpacking privilege and everyday casteism and anti-caste system, both in India and the Indian diaspora. And I have to say that there is not much scholarship which unpack one's privileged social location to drive scholarship in such a way that it takes up important questions of caste, household, and social justice. What becomes interesting about the paper is it actually turned the gaze from the domestic worker to the employer in relation to caste and livelihood. As she has many publications to her credit, her monograph titled Work, Labor and Cleaning, The Social Context of Outsourcing Housework was published by Bristol University Press in 2019. Most recently, she has co-authored a piece titled Under the Sci-Fi's COVID-19 and the Tiered British Domestic Work Industry. Latika also appeared on the BBC Listening Project in June 2019 with Sujan Walker in a short conversation titled Learning About You. I, on behalf of Laws of Social Reproduction Project, welcome you to make your presentation, Dr. Singh. Professor Prabha Kotishwaran, Principal Investigator of the project, will moderate the session. I welcome you all once again to the talk. Thank you. I hand over to Latika for the presentation.
Thank you, Sophie.
Yeah.
Will you bring up the, yes.
Yeah, so the slides are visible, right?
Yes, thank you. I would like to start by saying thank you very much to Sophie and Prabha. I'm very grateful to you for this opportunity to present my work, and to everyone else here today for taking out time to engage with it. So thank you very much for being here as well. Next slide, please. At a dinner table conversation last year about housework as a diasporic Brahmin business school lecturer talked about her India, she breezily said to my white British guests, "In India, we have servants." Then this August, in the LSC workshop on domestic work, Nalini Nayak of Seva noted that while the International Labour Organization or ILO Convention 189 on decent work for domestic workers has boosted their mobilization in India, workers continue to experience a lack of dignity, even though they are so indispensable in an Indian household. While earlier speaker Parvati Raghuram also posed this question: how do we think ethically of domestic work within a broader frame of shared ethics? While I was still thinking of these comments and questions, I heard Tanika Sarkar begin a lecture by saying, "Let's face it, all of our scholars belong to the master class and would have employed domestic servants at some stage in our lives." Next slide, please. Tanika's talk, however, focused not on class, but on historic intersections of caste and gender in domestic work in West Bengal. In fact, as a wealth of scholarship shows, more generally across contemporary India, caste continues to determine who can be a domestic worker. Today, I will argue that for a fuller understanding of the role of caste in perpetuating social injustices through paid domestic work, we need to shift the focus from caste as an embodied attribute of the domestic worker to casteism, that is, caste of the mind of the employer or client. One feature of casteism is distancing from manual labor, a fear that doing manual labor will somehow taint us. I will explore this through three aspects of domestic work, in particular the work of cleaning. One, understanding of paid domestic work as simply an extension of women's unpaid domestic work. Then I'll look at understandings of cleaning as unskilled manual labor. And finally, as the worker-client relationship and paying for domestic work. I focus on cleaning because privileged Indian households in the main have a conflicted relationship with cleanliness. In current times in the West, cleaning often happens once a week, but in these Indian households, house cleaning routinely happens practically every day, and washing the body can also be a ritual act. Still, many of us, to quote Anand Teltumde, whose incarceration I must mention remains a concern as I quote him, summarily accept India as a uniquely unclean country and uncritically link this to the persisting unhygienic poverty among certain communities who are often referred to as those people. Next slide, please. I will support my argument by drawing on the positive rebuttals of the hegemonic Brahmanical knowledge system by activists and scholars with lived experience of being a Dalit or Bahujan in India. Dalits are still untouchables in many ways, and Bahujans form part of who are officially called other backward castes or OBCs. I use Brahmanical to indicate a thought process and a knowledge system, and positive rebuttals not only denounce oppressive practices, but also present alternative possibilities. Next slide, please. I will apply these perspectives to my findings on paid domestic cleaning in two social contexts, one in the UK and one in India, that I studied in relation to the question, how is cleaning work conceptualized by white British and Indian women who provide independent cleaning services, that is, they don't work for a cleaning agency, as well as by white British and Indian feminist or gender-orientated academic women who outsourced cleaning. In this, I was particularly interested in the guilt some British people feel around outsourcing their domestic work. I also draw on secondary data such as internet forums on outsourcing cleaning in the UK and other published accounts in India, as well as my never-ending conversations and observations in real life on these issues. My cross-cultural analysis is informed by my varifocal diasporic gaze that is located in the interstices between the two cultures and unpacks the similarities and differences between what is said and what isn't said by the different women. Next slide, please. So I'll start with looking at what are called the continuities between paid domestic work and unpaid domestic work. Kanja Elaya's book on dignity of labor for children starts with a reminder of the 1980s anti-reservation protests, when many hegemonic caste young people took to the streets with brooms. They were telling us that the Mandal Commission's reservation policy was an affront to their dignity. They would have to do the despised manual labor that their fellow citizens who were demanding reservations were naturally expected to do. Fast forwarding to 2014, when I was asking the UK academics about cleaning, they talked to me about cleaning. But when I asked the same thing in India, as seen as the extract on the slide, many academics talked about cooking instead of cleaning. So Gitanjali here talked about pressure in the kitchen when guests didn't help. But when I asked if this extended to sweeping and mopping, she said, as I've highlighted in bold, that this wasn't her domain. She hadn't thought about it. In other words, in the domestic socialization of hegemonic caste women, cooking is at the center, but cleaning is at the margins of their work. Next slide, please. Now, distancing from manual labor like cleaning is also a feature of class. Picture the English Victorian gentlewoman with her spotless and endlessly long white gloves. But social, economic, religious and cultural reforms accelerated by the two world wars changed that somewhat. Significantly, first there was a decline in the aristocratic way of life in Britain's grand country houses with their armies of live-in servants. And second, in the mid-20th century, while many kinds of work continued to have low status and many middle-class people continued to use the services of the daily charwoman, with the establishment of the welfare state and a raising of the standard of living of the working class people, the social distance between middle-class status and manual labor reduced. For example, many young people across classes began their journey of independence by doing what are called entry-level jobs, including cleaning. And there is historic precedence to this as well, which I talk about in my book. I'm not going to talk about it now. In casteism or caste of the mind, however, the distancing from manual labor also involves a distancing from the material reality within which one lives. How has this happened and continues to happen? Gopal Guru writes that the human struggle to exist in meaningful ways includes a need for greater social recognition. The competition for this social recognition amongst ourselves is reduced by the hegemonic Brahmanical purity pollution ideology and the attendant caste system underpinned by the Varna theory. The system sanctions a kind of total rejection, says Guru, of some other humans. That is, we push them, he says, beyond the civilizational framework, rendering them completely unseeable, unapproachable, and untouchable, as the image on the slide from a photo story on sewage workers in the caravan shows. This is a fairly new article. The man is so visible, but is either unseen or is purposefully being unseen, like by the woman who's shielding her face, and the other people in the picture who are just going about their work. Also, to paraphrase Sundar Sarukkai, the caste of the mind teaches us to perceive reality as an illusion, so doing the hard work of nurturing that reality is no longer seen as our responsibility. Our hegemonic discourses help us to do this without any feeling of compunction, a point I will come back to in part 3. Here I just want to mention that in the colonial period, when distancing from manual labor as a symbol of class in the UK was at its height, there was a move to introduce some regulations for domestic workers even in India. But as Nitin Sinha noted at that August workshop, when our colonial rulers tried to do this, more resistance came from Indian employers whose purity pollution rules I have even heard being referred to as refined norms. Next slide, please. Coming back to the current time, Baby Haldar is a domestic worker and a writer. A journalist visiting her in 2012 commented, "But when Baby Haldar asks her employer to switch off the kitchen lights, frankly, we're a bit taken aback. Even Haldar concedes this is extraordinary. Would have I been able to do this in any other house?" Haldar was also interviewed by historian Swapna Banerjee. Swapna felt that Baby didn't critique the social system. Rather, she spoke about, and I quote Swapna, her desires to attain and enjoy the quality and privilege of a respectable life, end quote. Baby's autobiography, though, includes mentions of her employer, Prabodh Kumar, doing cleaning work. Perhaps Savarna journalists and researchers overlook this detail, as I also did on my first reading, because we are so attuned to, and I quote Anand Teltumde again, to externalizing that responsibility of maintaining cleanliness to somebody else. This caste of the mind works even when we use the services of people from outwith the established caste system. For example, Neha Vadhavan found that middle-class service users in new developments in Jharkhand impose the same Brahmanical practices of purity and pollution and tactics of casteist humiliation to control, quote end, Adivasi domestic workers. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another issue I want to consider here is toilet cleaning. No, the slide before this, sorry. The slide before this. Another issue I want to consider here is toilet cleaning and waste disposal. In urban India, many migrant domestic workers live in slums with communal toilets or may be defecating in the open. Cleaning a bathroom and toilet isn't something that such workers would be doing in their own homes. According to the 2011 Indian census, just over half of Indian households have latrines. Of these, only a quarter are connected to the piped sewer system, presumably looked after by public employees with labor rights. Another 47% of latrines are connected to a septic tank. Recently, Dhruv Gangadharan described the scene in one of Chennai's posh districts as he stepped out for his morning walk and noticed that his Brahmin neighbor was getting his septic tank cleaned. He writes, clad in a white dhoti and a white towel that would cover his bare chest, just enough to display his holy thread, he hastily observes the open tank from a measured distance with a look of disapproval, yet with a cautious keenness for want of cleaner drains with smoother flows that would bring his in-house aesthetic back to normalcy. As I get closer, a head pops out of the tank and another man reveals himself carrying slurry on a tray. This man is called a manual scavenger, although he is doing domestic work. He's removing the waste produced by a household. Next slide, please. And next, yeah, thank you. It required much campaigning by the Safai Karamchari Andolan, an NGO started by children of manual scavengers and led by Bezwada Wilson, before we passed legislation in 1993 to end this inhuman practice. But there's much more evidence than just that anecdote showing that the legislation has failed. In 2014, when the Prime Minister launched the Swachh Bharat mission, the way the campaign was pitched shows that we still consider the Valmikis responsible for creating Swachh Bharat for us. Drawing on Anand Teltumde again, the Prime Minister might have wielded a broom for starting the campaign, but he is from the OBC category himself. How many hegemonic caste politicians were also sweeping with him? Now the bill is up for a second round of amendments, showing how we are still struggling to get our head around cultural reform related to our problem with manual labor, in other words, caste of the mind. As a couple of articles just published in The Wire show, we start from a position of denial, claiming, for example, that Delhi is free of the scourge when it isn't, and when the government is also actually contracting manual scavengers to do some cleaning, even when it is illegal. We are also quibbling over how many numbers of people are actually doing this work, and we're not ensuring that the families of those who die while cleaning our septic tanks and sewage systems get the monetary relief that we did promise them in the bill. Beyond domestic work, the poor working conditions of nurses and other ancillary health workers have also been in the limelight thanks to the pandemic. We did bajao thalis to salute them, but often only from a distance from the safety of our homes. But that hasn't done much for the conditions of work and our callous attitude here, writes Karuna Vilinga, also in The Caravan, and she shows that it is also heavily influenced by the caste of the mind, the issues that are going on in this field of work as well. Next slide now, please. So some of us could argue we aren't alone here. Class societies also show similar issues. And so the ILO Convention 189 had to put it in writing the need for fair terms of employment and decent conditions of work because, and I quote them, vestiges of the traditional approach to domestic work remain so troublingly present across a lot of cultures and societies. However, that can't be an excuse to become complacent about it in India because we know internationally, unlike class and race, we have resisted Dalit attempts to add caste into international instruments of social justice. And in fact, even in the ILO's document, caste is only mentioned once in the introduction. And in the context of today's topic, the cultural underpinning of the exploitation of domestic workers is troubling in its presence, not as a vestige, but as a significant persistence of times gone by, which is clearly revealed when we think in terms of casteism. Besides revealing discontinuities rather than continuities between paid and unpaid domestic work, foregrounding casteism also sheds light on the gendered division of labor in hegemonic caste households. Like Gitanjali, Usha told me, men may not be cleaning, but that's something even you won't do. In other words, when women don't see a particular task as their own work, why would they expect their men to share it? Next slide, please. Now I will talk a little about understanding cleaning as unskilled manual labor. Now I've written at length about this in my book, So this is a very brief summary here. Kanja Elaya argues that both mental and manual labor are necessary for a rounded experience of being human. In the West, the dichotomy of work into manual and mental labor is usually ascribed to Descartes in the so-called Enlightenment period. However, in India, it goes back much longer. Baba Saheb Ambedkar's now classic observation that the caste system was not merely a division of labor, but a division of laborers has 5 aspects. Let's look at point 2 and 3 in more detail. So that's caste dissociates work from interest and caste disconnects intelligence from manual labor. In my research, the conditions of work in the Indian setting, for example, doing the work because that's pretty much what's available to you, squatting while working, very poor enumeration, workers mostly being illiterate, and the often casteized segregation of tasks meant many workers were disinvested in their work, as Anika says here. I haven't liked any of my employers. We are just passing time, and that's it. We are just working out of majboori. Otherwise, the best place is in our own home. But we had to migrate to fill our stomachs. Otherwise, we don't have any home here or house or anything. That's it. We just do the jhadu pocha and survive. Next slide, please. In the UK, the white British independent cleaners I talked to were all literate. Two-thirds of them were what we call +2 pass. And they had worked in a range of jobs and were providing what could be called bespoke house cleaning services, like what Usha noticed when she went abroad. I'm amazed by the level of quality of the work which is done. Kitchen is sparkling, everything is in place, the slabs are clean, the cupboards also, if she has time, you know, the bed sheets are removed, done, machine, ta-ta-ta. Fantastic work. While here you have to be on the head, supervising, checking. I mean, here in my loo, you'll find that she hasn't cleaned the shower or the walls and I have to get it done or I have to do it myself. But there, it's done as a routine. Now here, I'm not making simply a case that good quality cleaning is skilled manual labor. Skill is an ambiguous term, and the value afforded to particular skills is known to shift with the gender and race of the worker. Instead, what I'm saying is that high quality, paid for cleaning needs both mental and manual skills. Not all cleaners are fantastic, like what Usha is describing. Next slide, please. I have heard these kinds of comments many times. And people, like these 2 comments on the slide, people being thankful for having a lovely cleaner who's doing a really good job, while others talk about having cleaner after cleaner and giving up because they just weren't able to do it the way the people wanted them to. Indeed, as Veera laughingly told me, and Veera was a cleaning service provider I interviewed in the UK, cleaners aren't miracle workers with a magic wand. A good cleaner, a cleaning fairy, will have knowledge of cleaning materials and procedures, what works and what doesn't. They will tell their clients what they want to use and often bring their own vacuum cleaners and so on. Next slide, please. But technical knowledge alone isn't enough. Jessica had used cleaners in the past when she had been a full-time customer services advisor and was setting up a cleaning business herself when I met her. As she told me, another reason I know that I'm good at my work is because I've had cleaners in the past. 3 cleaning ladies before and even quite a big company. And they seemed to sweat and they seemed to be doing all this. But when I went around afterwards, it really wasn't to my standard. Moreover, individual preferences transform houses into unique homes. A house can look and feel different when it is occupied by different people. Good cleaning service providers deploy mental labor to clean in a way that refreshes but doesn't disturb that individual homeliness of the house, as Iris is saying here. So she was answering my question about what makes a good cleaner. What makes a good cleaner is having some knowledge about how to do things properly, which they've learned from somewhere, and probably a certain willingness to listen when I say I want more of this and less of that. Yeah, so there is a skill element and a kind of responsiveness element. Indeed, much responsiveness is required in cleaning because people have different notions about dirt, cleanliness, orderliness, or homemaking. And I found this in both in India and in the UK. People were telling me different things about in relation to their ideas of cleanliness. And good cleaners gauge this and work accordingly in contrast to what they might do in their own living space. There's also the issue of attitude to cleaning. The most successful cleaning service providers in my UK sample clearly articulated a commitment to the work. If you don't enjoy cleaning, you're jogging uphill, said Martha, who worked as a bank teller for 2 days of the week and as an independent cleaning service provider for 3 days. So she said, you have to be quite thorough. You have to have attention to detail. You just can't clean stainless steel. You have to work it up and buff it up. If you haven't got that inclination to do it properly, it won't look right and it won't look nice. Next slide, please. Mental work in cleaning also involves crafting an economy of time and movement, as Yvonne's description of her work revealed. Obviously, you'll go in and put in all the products in the kitchen or in the bathroom, and you'll bleach the toilet and leave the spray in the bath and then do the dusting in the bedrooms and obviously do the floors last. But you'll also switch on the kettle as soon as you get there just to boil the water for the mop, and so on. Mental alertness was also required when tasks were split between visits and for not missing out things. These independent cleaners also needed all the mental skills required to run a small business, including negotiating and marketing skills. In India, many workers said that their mind dwelt elsewhere when they worked, on family issues and so on. But they still needed mental grit. It isn't easy to maintain quality in work you aren't invested in, and when your mind is often in a state of tension. I was struck by the way this English word was often used by the otherwise non-English speaking domestic workers in my Indian research site. And despite the construction of cleaning as just physical, degrading, lowly manual labor, the Indian workers were commonly scolded as if they were children who lacked mental ability. Why can't you get this into your head? Is your brain filled with sawdust? Have you lost your mind? Next slide, please. As Kancha Elias Shepherd has shown, many processes of so-called manual labor done by Madigas and Chamars require complex knowledge of materials and methods. For example, in the traditional method of washing clothes, the introduction of soil soap and heated water at dhobi ghats require thinking on the part of the people doing the work. Much before Elias Shepherd, E.V. Ramaswamy of Periyar had pointed out that in a society organized around Varna Dharma, the mental manual dichotomy is a discursive tool, an everyday violence for maintaining hegemony. It allows the hegemonic caste to believe that so-called manual work possesses no inherent worth or dignity, so as to easily distance ourselves from it while still enjoying the fruits of that work instead of the worker themselves. Indeed, the outcomes of housework are valued even if the processes are undervalued from the Savarna vantage point. In the UK, this often came through in comments like Felicity's here. Having a house that feels nice, that really does matter to me, otherwise I get miserable as well. And I think in terms of well-being, it really is making an enormous contribution, and it was outsourcing of the housework. And I mean that quite seriously, not in a kind of patronizing sort of, oh, your work does matter kind of way. In India, only one academic who spent much time traveling voiced similar sentiments. Let me just check. Yeah, it's okay. Yes, so this didn't mean that the others didn't care. When housework is done daily to the same extent, people are more likely to note what isn't done, the matter out of place, like Mohini is saying here. That however pleased I am that I've done everything in a tip-top way, that this time ma'am will come back and say, Mohini, you've done a great job, but ma'am will somehow point out some deficiency or the other. Then I get that feeling within me. I've been working since morning and I'm tired, and now see, ma'am is still speaking to me in this way. Yes, this hurts a bit. Next slide, please. Also in the class context, people who like cleaning can feel they are somewhat freaks or mad or plain losers. But in the context of casteism, however, according to Periyar, the divorcing of the hegemonic caste consciousness from everyday life processes and the work of nurturing ourselves and our living spaces leads to it becoming an alienated consciousness. We don't mind spending money to make ourselves do physical exercise, but consider work that involves physical exercise beneath us and make paying for it a site of struggle for the domestic worker. Next slide, please. In the UK, most cleaners said that they had a friendly work relationship with their clients, and the academics also said the same for their cleaners. While both material and cultural injustices were present in this relationship and are detailed in my book, they didn't erase the possibility of what Ramaswamy Mahalingam calls the interpersonal aspect of dignity. For example, the work was appreciated, such as with text messages saying thank you, and people doing pre-tidying before the worker was due for the weekly clean, and some people expressing guilt for outsourcing what they considered was personal work or even demeaning work. But in India, no one in my sample said they had a friendly work relationship with their domestic worker or vice versa, and no service user expressed any guilt over outsourcing. The marketized relationship was often underpinned by quibbling, or in Hindi as it's called, khich-khich. In the alternative and still also prevalent benevolent paternalistic relationship, service users pay more than the going rate in indirect ways, such as payment of medical bills or children's school fees or paying in kind. The ILO's Convention 189 considers payment in kind acceptable if agreed with the worker, although it cautions against noblesse oblige, which is the Western notion placing a moral duty among upper class people to do charities or take paternalistic interest in servants' welfare while retaining privilege. Next slide, please. In India, ideas of noblesse oblige are predated by similar ideas from much older times, for example in the Manusmriti, which dictated that Shudras are not only required to serve the other three castes, but to do so meekly and remain forever economically independent on those others. As Baba Saheb Ambedkar noted, Manu's law of wages is not a minimum wage law, it's a maximum wage law. It was also an iron law fixed so low that there was no fear of the Shudra accumulating wealth and obtaining economic security. The word fear is important here. Next slide, please. As hegemonic caste people pose as modern uncasted beings, this comment from Bhavna reveals how the fear of doing the manual labor assigned to someone else continues to determine our relationships with domestic workers. She said, "A good friend of mine abroad is a house cleaner. We hug. I mean, she's just like you and me. She's absolutely equal, my equal. There's nothing like she's a house cleaner. But in India, it isn't possible because it's so deeply embedded in the social structure here. A standard more or less is the same everywhere. Even the cleaners, everybody has a good living standard. But here the difference in money is so much, so extreme, and then the people think that money brings them power, and that gives them power to be able to say anything to them. So if I invite him to have lunch with me, he'll stop working for me. I can't ask him to do any other work for me." Gopal Guru argues that reduced social distance between the oppressed and hegemonic castes produces anxiety amongst the latter about them taking over from us or becoming us. When Dalits challenge hegemonic caste people by adopting their behaviors, we feel humiliated. We can also see this in domestic workers' unions' attempts to build solidarity with traditional trade unions. In the August workshop here, Sunita Eluri noted that when a central trade union, who is very strongly established in railways and banking sector, end quote, suggested to the banking sector employee members to talk about domestic workers' concerns, all the banking employees left the meeting. It reminds us of Mohandas Gandhi's cautioning that untouchables shouldn't be provoked to rebel. Sunita, however, didn't mention the C word in her talk. She said in her experience, it's only domestic workers organizing that will make a difference to them. Regulations and policies may come or may not happen. Surely this isn't fair. On the world stage, following George Floyd's death, the Black Lives Matter movement has yet again highlighted that the that the responsibility to change things should lie with those who create the oppression and not with those who are oppressed. In India, this point has been raised time and again by Dalit and Bahujan scholars and activists, but as Suraj Yangde puts it, the casteized mind doesn't feel guilty of oppressing others. The ideology of the caste system actually encourages people to continue to exploit. You don't have to feel guilty about it because people are where they are based on some cosmic justifications. Therefore, the policies which continue to operate today are very difficult to break through. Acknowledging this manifestation of casteism, in my view, is very relevant to the questions around improving work conditions of domestic workers. I will conclude by offering my understanding of how this can be realized in a meaningful way. Next slide, please. In Meena Dhanda's recent articulation of the philosophical foundations of anti-casteism, she refers to Ambedkar's notion of universal morality, for which she says we not only need to be inclusive, but we also need to show intellectual humility. The latter means incorporating into our literary canons the knowledge, systems, and thoughts of historically marginalized people. In my experience, engagement with Dalit Bahujan perspectives has been crucial to my understanding of how casteism forms part of researchers' own epistemological positioning, and also how recognizing or acknowledging it can help in addressing our own complicity in the system. It isn't easy because it puts the spotlight of social injustice on the caste of the mind within us instead of away from us on the casteized body of the domestic worker. Engaging with this literature helped me see the discontinuities between paid and unpaid domestic work and to have a more nuanced understanding of the persistence of Savarna men's absence in cleaning. However, more importantly, it helped me see, and here I am mindful, that fighting for good working conditions in historically exploitative occupations in itself isn't enough, as argued by K. Balagopal. And what Baba Sahib Ambedkar had said in What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables, and I quote him, "If Gandhism preached that scavenging is a noble profession with the object of inducing those who refuse to engage in it, one could understand it." So most importantly, what I have learned through my engagement with Dalit Bahujan perspectives is that simply supporting domestic workers in their fight for labor rights alone is also casteist in itself. Improving conditions in the domestic work industry means acknowledging the mental work in manual labor and what exactly is the dirt in dirt, which, as I've shown here, is our casteized notions of work and labor. We need to get over the idea that doing manual labor will somehow make us lesser beings. We need to share not just our space with domestic workers, but share their spaces and their work. And this, I conclude, is a necessary prequel to any possibility of a shared ethics of paid domestic work in India. Thank you. Can I have the next slide? This is just to acknowledge all the literature that I drew on in the talk, and the last slide on which I just want to say thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Latika, for that really absolutely brilliant and provocative talk. I will, make sure that we have as much time as possible for our discussions. So I will maintain a queue. Please raise your hands if you have a question for Latika, or you can type in the question in the chat box as well. Is there anyone who has a question for Latika? We can't hear you, Latika.
Just saw the message from Parvati. Thank you very much. Much appreciate that. I've drawn a lot on your work.
I think there's Mahitosh. If you could please introduce yourself. Go ahead.
All right. Hi, I'm Mohitosh. I'm from Kolkata. I'm an assistant professor of English at Presidency University, Kolkata. It's an amazing presentation from Latika, and I really enjoyed it. Just can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead. Go ahead. Hi, Mahitosh. Are you there? You can go ahead, Mahitosh. Hello. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry. Probably, yeah, I got
Yes,
disconnected.
we can hear you.
So, yeah, so that's an excellent presentation. I just wanted to, connect something that I have recently come across, which is the idea of subaltern mathematics. A few of my colleagues from the USA, they're working on what they call subaltern mathematics. And this is basically a comment in connection with what Latika brilliantly put as the mental work in the manual work. Subaltern mathematics basically is a genre of research as of now, which deals with how the subalterns, particularly from Sundarbans and other remote parts of Bengal, and also they're extending it to other villages from across the world, where people usually from quote unquote lower class, but in the context of India, people from lower castes, they engage in various kinds of work, not necessarily linked with domestic work, but also let's say building a boat, or building a table. People who are not officially trained into creating furnitures or boats or ships and other things. How, and even more importantly, in Bangla we call it thunga, which is those paper cups, if you like, made of paper. Now those newspapers which are wasted or sold out, some people in villages, and most of them in the context of Bengal are from among the scheduled castes. They collect these paper cups, these newspapers, usually wasted, and left out, abandoned by upper caste households, and they build different paper-made containers to sell food, etc. The interesting, build, let's say, furniture or a boat or a paper container, which they then give it to different shops. The calculation that happen in their mind, they are never trained in mathematics. They are never trained in geometry. They are never trained in, they're not, most of them are educated. Most of them are not even educated. They didn't even go to the schools, let alone colleges and universities. So this is just came to my something that came to my mind with reference to the mental work. I think, although not directly related to domestic work industry, as Latika brilliantly pointed out, but these things could also be considered, that how people can engage in scientific calculation, mathematical calculation, without being trained by the so-called sovereign institutions. Just that was a comment, but thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Mahitosh, for that. I mean, Kancha Laya has written a lot on the mental labor involved in various other things. And this, in fact, his little book on that dignity of labor for children is very interesting to read in this aspect. And though the one you are mentioning is not in that, I think it adds to that. And what is interesting was that Kanchalai also writes that he's not able. There are not many references in his book, and that's partly because we haven't just paid attention to all this mental labor in the past. So you can't write a paper on these things and reference it even somewhere. So really, but interesting to hear about the subaltern mathematics in that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? I may have missed your hand.
I think Shalini has a question. Shalini,
please go ahead. Shalini, yeah. Go ahead.
You're muted, Shalini.
Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. That was just fantastic
I'm just like, it was just so good. So thank you so much. I mean, I think just 2 comments really. Just we don't have to always ask questions, do we? It can be. The first is that I think it's a really important point that, you know, it's important what you're saying, that we need to call upon our privilege in engaging with this subject. I mean, I'm writing a book on domestic work, but, you know, in India, I couldn't manage my career where there is no childcare without having a full-time domestic worker. And I'm struggling with how to include that, how to deal with my positionality in my book. And it's not just me. There have been several scholars who have worked on domestic workers and it's never even reached their dissertation that they had a domestic worker, or, you know, there has been a denial around this, and we need to, like you're saying, you know, we have to find a way as feminists to engage with this. The second is your divide between the the UK scholarship and the India scholarship, which of course in your book was central as well, right? Now, I just want to export that to my own context, which is the expatriate households versus local households in Delhi, where, you know, expats would display very liberal tendencies, and Indian and domestic work are gravitating to them to get out of the caste system. But as you go along, those same expats, you will find, are really inferiorizing their domestic workers. And if it's not caste, it's race. So the same, it won't be so public, the caste, but, you know, it'll come in discourses of hygiene time and time again, that segregation. So is your division between UK and local, do you also meet with some of this to some extent, or are you, or is it a bit, do you think you need to just, maybe think a little about that and just tell us? Because those very progressive expats, I can tell you that as time went on, it became a different story. Yeah, thank you very much. No, I in fact mentioned in my book, to put it in the presentation, my social contexts in the UK and India were very much particular social contexts. You know, I mean, I'm very aware that in both countries, there are different forms of domestic work. And, you know, the samples I found were not representative of the whole countries and the way the work is done in the countries. In fact, in the UK, I mean, most of the scholarship is around, in the West, most of the scholarship is around the race issue of a migrant domestic worker doing the work for a white woman, say. But my experience in the UK was that this is common, yes, in big cities like London and all. But when you go more north and the migrant population reduces, it's the white people who are doing, you know, this work as well. There is a class, the class element comes in. And in fact, in my little town where I belong to a very middle class Indian population who are using local white people for all this work, you know, whether it's gardening or DIY or whatever, that's all being done by local white people. And yes, I know Eastern Europeans are also coming in, but we still have, because I'm constantly looking at this, and I've found, and in my research, by chance, it happened that the white British academic women I was talking to all had white British cleaners as well. I didn't go looking for them, but that kind of just doubled the size of my own thing. So they are particular contexts, but those particular contexts showed me these things. But I totally agree with you. That's very interesting how people change when you change location. Like Bhavna was saying, when she was, you know, abroad, she could hug this cleaner and feel okay. But when she was in India, the domestic worker is at this, at the distance. And I can see that the same thing, you know, is, so when we say white people are doing it this way, that's also very contextual. Yeah, the moment they enter the Indian casteized world, they can start behaving very much the same. Like, and your research is fantastic there. I mean, I do cite that in my book as well. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful, Latika. Just such a pleasure.
Thank you. I think while we wait for more questions, maybe one thing, having had the benefit of reading your paper, you have a very evocative kind of example of how during the pandemic, the joys of the magic mop had been discovered in many Indian households. And I'm just curious about, how the pandemic, I think it's shifted something within all of us when it comes to, managing our households, rethinking the level of, domestic work we want to do, and how we are thinking about how frequently it has to be done and to what standard and so on. So I'm just wondering whether you see any has this been captured in any way, and how long lasting do you think this memory might be during this moment of disruption?
Thank you, Prabha. Yes, I couldn't talk about it in my in the talk to just for the sake of time, but I was referring to Anchal Dhal's paper here, and I think Anchal is in the audience. And Anchal has done work in Delhi, and she found the same thing as me. Actually, that people's ideas of cleanliness and how much work should be done and all is always variable. Actually, it's not just to do with the pandemic. I mean, in my research, I was finding that even within India, I had women, amongst the academics, some were telling me, yeah, we tolerate, they tolerate substandard work or whatever. Some will do, sort it out themselves. Some say that that's okay. That's the way I live, and I'm all right with that. So those, even within those notions of cleanliness, what we actually do in practice can be quite different in different households, and that is not culture specific. It's across cultures. And what I found, and I've read a bit of Anchal's thesis. She's also found the same, and I think what's interesting is, but we still, I mean, practically we have this, but that cast of the mind still makes us away from, takes us away from just doing that work to whatever level we do. But when we have to do it ourselves, yes, we are changing standards also. We're not expecting to do the same thing. It's happening all the time.
Great, thank you. So I think Neha and Parvati have comments. So Neha and then Parvati.
Thanks, Prabha. Thank you, Lotika. I think that was a fascinating presentation and lots to think about. And I'm really glad you're talking about outing ourselves as employers, because I think that's really critical. To reflect upon what kind of practices we encourage within our households. I was curious, if you'd like to perhaps also highlight the second, the surname of the employers that you have interviewed. And I'm saying this because it might be interesting to look at inter-upper caste differences in notions of cleanliness as well. I have a personal anecdote to share, and it's very interesting. I mean, I'm not a Brahmin, but it's interesting that in the same apartment set that I live in, my part-time domestic worker also works for a Brahmin household on top. And it's very interesting to see that despite there's no discussion on our caste, the fact that I eat pork, beef, everything, does, I think, lead to some kind of understanding without having really spoken about it, of a little more flexibility. And I'm saying this because, she's always in a hurry to go to this Brahmin lady's household, and she understands that she has to spend more time there because she's a Brahmin, and she's actually set this as a reason, that wo Brahmin hai, so I have to do more. And I think it's really interesting because as feminists to also understand that, housework never ends at some level, right? But how do really these inter-upper caste differences play out? And I think, it's a pity Nalini has left, because Seva does very interesting work on training domestic workers, and the whole idea of professionalization as becoming a way of bargaining for better wages is something that they strongly believe in. But I think it's really something for all of us to reflect upon, those who do skill training for domestic workers, in terms of what kind of standards we are setting in that. So in the name of professionalization, are we actually setting Brahminical standards of cleanliness in the work that domestic workers are expected to carry out? Thanks so much again.
No, thank you. Thank you for those really interesting observations. So yeah, coming to the first point, sorry, your last point first. I mean, that is an issue with professionalization. We've seen in other countries as well. People have written about it in Malaysia, and even for migrant domestic workers who go from sort of say Malaysia to Taiwan and things that, you know, people are being they're being taught to do things in that servile way, which we actually don't want. You know, you don't want actually the work to be done. So there is that. So there, I kind of feel that the independent worker, you know, independent cleaners who negotiate themselves with their clients on a one-to-one basis rather than going through an agency, actually gives much still is to me, I mean, I found it as the most sort of you can say professional way of working, with most autonomy in the work, you know, and in that but there is some work from quite old work in 1991 in California, where there was the name of the author is slipping my mind right now, but she wrote about two collectives, one Latino collectives, and one consisted of, you know, women who were not really interested in the work. They were just migrants coming in just to do this work and move on to something else. And then but then there were these middle class Latino women who were doing, you know, providing a very professional service again, and they had training and things, but they were working as a collective, not through an agency. And I think Seva also is a collective. So I whatever little bit I've read about them, I found that there were possibilities there, but maybe I'll need to talk more and understand more about it there. Regarding the surnames and things, at that time, I mean, I do obviously have the original names lying with me, though I've only used pseudonyms later. But certainly, I mean, even in my sample, like I had two women who had stopped outsourcing work. Even in India, I wasn't expecting to find people, you know, who were not using domestic workers, but two women had stopped, and they gave me, you know, good reasons, and so they were doing the work themselves. And there were a few others who did talk of, you know, cleaning the same way like the UK women would, but in the majority, there was more talk of cooking always rather than cleaning coming through. But what you're saying about upper caste, yeah, I mean, these are things I think even for future research, would love to find out more about that myself. Thank you.
Parvati?
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for a great presentation. So I just wanted to bring a few characters who are like not in the story, like the is it a direct responsibility or a relationship between two women? What about the role of the state or community? So that was one set of things. And the other thing which in bringing in other characters is the fact that when I came here and then I give a presentation, very often the irrespective of the topic, the British audience will say, but what about caste, right? So in some senses, how do you hold together the complete and significance of caste with the fact that actually the over-validation or over-determination of caste is itself circulating in very racist ways? So when expats, as Shalini was saying, was, you know, talk about, I mean, you know, we are not casteist like the Indians. That's because they want to set themselves apart from the Indians because they, you know, in a hierarchical manner of looking down. So I think those are also without recognizing. And so I really love that turn of everybody having to look into themselves. I thought that was just a fantastic sort of ending. But so yeah, but I was just wanted to sort of get some comments from you. It's not a question, but just some reflections. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I mean, class is there, very much there. I think Britain is a very much class society, and I mean, it's there even in, like I said, there are material and cultural injustices in the more egalitarian relationship that I found here. It was more egalitarian, but it was far from perfect. And actually, I have written about all that in my book. In my book, I draw a lot. I talk a lot about the class injustices in this within sort of the white, because I was looking at white British sort of, yes, cleaners working and white British academics, outsourcing. So I have covered a lot of that, and they definitely there is still, I mean, we know cleaning is low wage work in the UK, and a lot of cleaners, especially the more educated ones, some of them did feel they were looked down on. I mean, there was one girl who she was she had joined university, but she hadn't finished. Partly she said, I just don't like the academic way of writing. I want to be a writer, but at the moment I'm quite happy being a cleaner. And her boyfriend was an IT sort of professional, and she when I went to meet her, I mean, she was living in the middle of this big town and in a fairly sort of affluent neighborhood, but she said, I enjoy doing this work, but I find it very embarrassing when I go to a party with my boyfriend and I say I'm a cleaner, and then people look at me, oh, so you're just a cleaner. So that's very much still there, even there, and I do talk about it in my book. Regarding, yes, the other actors, the state and things, definitely, I think when it comes to paying for the work and things, I mean, how much of it should be social care, how much of it should be private care, I think it's very complicated. But to me, before we get there, we need to sort of remove this cultural barrier of the manual distancing from work that we have, and then get there. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that right now. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have two more questions. One is from Lela Kadiwal. If you could please introduce yourself, and then Sumit Bodh. Lela, go ahead.
Thank you, Latika. I really enjoyed what you've done. It's really a powerful conversation and a very important one. And I've really learned a lot from how you compared and contrasted the two contexts. So thank you for that. And Latika, my question revolves around the intersections of religion and groups, because I know, like, I'm really glad you highlighted the issue of privilege and positionality as well. So I know a lot of my social circle have Bengali Muslim appas, working in their households. And with increasing Islamophobia and anti-Bengali sentiments, I wonder in your research if there is also some discussions around, and we also know that many Muslims come from hitherto untouchable backgrounds, or even, oppressed caste backgrounds. So is there any?
Yeah, actually in my sample, this was chance. I mean, I didn't go particularly looking, but in the areas I was in by chance, there were no Muslim domestic workers I talked to. But I am aware, and I've heard, in my view, that people, yes, have been sort of, they're having to pose as Hindus and things like that. That's happening. But not just because of the current situation, but even in the past, because of the taboos around, who can caste and things. This has been happening before also. But it's something I haven't explored in much more detail.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Sumit?
you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Singha. And a big hello to Prabha Kotiswaran and Carmel Christie, who I know from before, and I'm so happy to see here. Dr. Singha, I just wanted to, take a leaf out of your presentation in which you referred to the casteist or the caste of domestic. And with this, I'm hoping to combine both your work and also the work of Prabha Kotiswaran in the areas of sex work, as we know that there is a certain caste composition to sex workers. So when we talk about the casteized body of domestic workers, is there also an understanding of the sexualized body of domestic workers? And where this could be taken to would be the rampant sexual harassment that there would be within the confines of indoor spaces. And there's the kind of silence and invisibility that there would be to this kind of sexual harassment. I just wanted to know if at any point in engaging with these Dalit Bahujan perspectives on domestic workers, there is any articulation of this particularity of domestic workers and the sexual harassment. And another way in which this could perhaps be related with the work of Prabha Koteeswaran is that when we think about domestic work, do we narrow it down to cleaning work, as if sexual intimacy and sex work isn't domestic work? So, is there an overlap between domestic work and domestic workers and the work done by sex workers? And is sexual intimacy also domestic work?
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting because as far as the sort of literature that I was looking at, doesn't specifically talk about domestic work. Actually, I couldn't find much on domestic work in the Dalit Bahujan literature itself. It was the wider ideas that I was taking from there, but there is a lot on certainly on the sex work and on the sexual exploitation of Dalit women. Of course, there's plenty there. But what's interesting for me here is, and this is a very initial thought, because it came up briefly between, I mean, 2-3 people, through 2-3 women mentioned it in the UK, and in fact, even Baby Haldar has mentioned somewhere that, you know, at least I'm doing domestic work, I'm not doing sex work. And this came up even in you know, a couple of women I was talking to. They did not equate what they were doing as domestic work with sex work. For them, that was a different thing, and they were actually possibly looking down on it, the way they were talking to me about it. So when academics actually put the two things together, I'm now a little unsure about how to actually should we put it together. Do we need to talk to, you know, people in both fields and see how they see it? So that's one thing there. The other thing, yeah, definitely, though, I mean, they are both. It's all about service. In the end, yeah, you're doing some sort of service. But like I said, I mean, because of the way these women said that they were actually distinguishing that what they're doing is clean work, and, you know, sex work is dirty work. I want to actually explore this a bit more. I would say I don't know. I need to think more about it and research more about it. And that would be useful to ask Prabha for her I think comments on it.
Great. I think we have a question from Sophie.
Yeah, thank you, Prabha. Lautika, thank you for a wonderful presentation for grounding caste in domestic work. I'm just thinking, how does the mental and menial categories you laid out in the paper could talk back to casteism in academia? Here I am thinking about Gopal Guru's article about theoretical Brahmins, empirical Shudras, in which more important aspects of work is oriented to help the cultural capital of upper caste. Do you have a response to that?
Yes, thank you. I think that, yeah, there are two things here probably. One is, yeah, I mean, whole professions, as we know, have been kind of, you know, I'm thinking of Ajanta Subramaniam's work on engineering and the caste and how, you know, to make engineering palatable to Brahmins and upper caste people in India, they had to remove the manual labor from it and make it a very theoretical discipline. And it was even, I'm reading historically somewhere that when the first upper caste person became a doctor in India, that was a huge thing, because they were having to kind of handle dead bodies and all, and that was really massive thing. So But at the same time, I'm thinking of what Periyar talks about, when you are just theorizing from this very high level and you develop this alienated consciousness. So I do think there's a serious problem there, and I agree with Gopal Guru, and I think we really need to bring the menial back into or what we call menial. I mean, menial as is original meaning just means manual work. It doesn't mean, it originally did not mean low value work. So I do think, I mean, for me, there is a lot of rethinking around these things that needs to be done.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions or comments? Any last thoughts? Okay, I think we've gone off a little bit over time, but I just really wanted to thank you. I think it's just testament to the groundbreaking work that you're doing, Latika, that you've shared very kindly, your research, and I think more importantly, at some point, it would be really important to understand how we can decastize a lot of the work that we are doing. How does one read the classics in a way, the Dalit classics in a way to really revisit our own sort of professional and personal commitments in this very rich and thorough way. And also to then unpack what this means for so-called progressive movements, because we often take it for granted that within the domestic workers movement, we need to fight for minimum wages, we need to fight for working conditions and all of that without really going deeper. And maybe there the language of rights and legal advocacy really runs out. So I think this is very thought-provoking, I think, for people from many disciplines. So we've recorded your talk, and we hope to share it with many people who couldn't be here but would express interest in your lecture. So thank you very much for taking the time to share your paper with us and to think with us. And thank you all for joining us today as well. And we will post this recording on our website, share it within several mailing lists. Thank you all very much. And we will meet again in January, on the 8th of January. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Latika. And for all the questions. And I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.